In October 2017, the heavy steel doors of the Classé audio factory in Lachine, Quebec, locked for the final time. Inside, the silence was absolute. CNC machines that once milled the curved faceplates of $10,000 amplifiers sat cold. Dozens of skilled technicians, the hands that built the analog soul of Canadian high-end audio, were suddenly out of work, their decades of craftsmanship erased by a single administrative decision from a new corporate owner. The paradox is that Classé did not disappear because the audio market stopped listening. It vanished from Canada because the brand had succeeded so well at becoming a global luxury icon that it was swallowed by the ruthless economics of the digital age. But the real story of Classé is not merely the closing of a factory. It is the story of how a stubborn Quebec analog workshop became trapped in the relentless cycle of home theater software. And what happens when the physical soul of a brand is traded for the precision of a global supply chain. Every week, we tell the stories of Canadian speakers, amplifiers, audio brands, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Montreal, Quebec, in 1980. In the late 1970s, the Canadian high-fidelity market was undergoing a quiet, demanding revolution. Audiophiles in Montreal living rooms and Toronto basement rec rooms were moving away from simple bookshelf speakers and beginning to invest in massive, exotic loudspeakers. These new designs, towering electrostatic panels and complex multi-driver arrays, sounded magnificent. But they presented a brutal physical and electrical challenge to the equipment trying to run them. To understand the problem, you have to understand impedance, the electrical load a speaker presents to an amplifier. A standard consumer speaker might sit safely at 8 ohms, acting like a wide pipe that lets electrical current flow easily. But these new exotic speakers often dropped below 2 ohms, violently shrinking the pipe and demanding massive instant current. The amplifier, an electronic device that increases a weak audio signal so it can drive speakers, would try to deliver that sudden current, overheat, and abruptly fail. Mike Viglas knew this failure intimately. Viglas was a highly successful, larger-than-life businessman based in Montreal with a deep, consuming passion for high-end stereo systems. He had the financial resources to buy the most expensive, highly reviewed American and Japanese electronics on the market. But in his own Montreal listening room, surrounded by the most demanding speakers money could buy, his exotic equipment kept breaking. Transistors would smoke. Internal fuses would blow. Protection circuits would abruptly shut the music down right at the orchestral crescendo. The problem Viglas faced was not a lack of volume. The problem was a lack of electrical stability. He realized that the global high-end audio market was full of delicate laboratory experiments that could not survive the harsh physical reality of a serious Canadian listening session. Viglas did not just want an amplifier, he specifically needed a power amp, a dedicated amplifier stage that provides the raw current and voltage needed to physically move heavy speaker drivers, separate from any volume controls or input switching. In 1979, Viglas was introduced to a young, obsessive audio engineer named David Reich. Reich did not care about the compromises of mass-market audio. He cared about absolute signal purity and unbreakable power delivery. Reich was privately experimenting with solid-state circuit designs that completely ignored the cost-cutting trends of the era. Viglas sat down to listen to one of Reich's hand-built prototypes. It sounded astonishingly clear, possessing a massive three-dimensional soundstage, the perceived width, depth, and placement of music created by a stereo system. But more importantly, when connected to a brutal, low-impedance speaker load, the prototype did not shut down. It did not distort. To understand why this matters, you must understand distortion. unwanted change added to the sound by the speaker, amplifier, source, or room. The prototype simply gripped the speaker and controlled it with absolute authority. Viglas, tired of writing endless checks for fragile foreign equipment, made a permanent decision. He would fund David Reich. They would build the indestructible amplifier that the global market refused to make. In 1980, they officially launched Classé Audio in Montreal. The name was a deliberate dual nod, a reference to the French word for class, or ranked highly, honoring their Quebec foundation, and a literal declaration of their core engineering philosophy. They were going to build pure Class A amplifiers. To understand why this was a radical and deeply impractical choice, you must understand Class A, an amplifier design where the output transistors are always fully on, drawing maximum power and generating massive heat, even when no music is playing. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, most consumer audio companies used Class A/B designs, which switched transistors on and off to run cooler, save electricity, and reduce manufacturing costs. Class A, by contrast, was horribly inefficient. It turned a metal chassis into a space heater. But by keeping the transistors constantly biased with high electrical current, it completely eliminated the microscopic, harsh switching distortion that occurred when electronic components rapidly turned on and off. The first product they brought to the Canadian audio market was the Classé DR2. The DR stood for David Reich. On paper, the DR2 looked like a terrible retail investment. It was rated at a mere 25 watts per channel. At the time, big box stereo stores and mainstream music stores were aggressively selling standard Japanese receivers, an amplifier with a radio tuner and source controls built into the same unit that loudly boasted over 100 watts for a fraction of the price. But the Classé DR2 weighed roughly 40 pounds. Its heavy metal chassis was dominated by a massive custom-wound transformer, an electrical part inside the amplifier that changes voltage and helps supply a massive reservoir of continuous power. The sides of the chassis were built entirely of enormous heat sinks, heavy metal fins designed specifically to pull the intense, constant heat away from the internal electronic components so they would not melt. The 25 watts of the DR2 were pure, unrelenting, high-current power. When a hi-fi dealer in a Toronto showroom hooked a cheap 100-watt receiver to a difficult speaker, the receiver would choke, clip, and the music would sound thin and compressed. But when that same dealer hooked up the 25-watt Classé DR2, the room violently pressurized. The woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and kick drums, moved with absolute pistonic control. The DR2 could drive an almost dead-short electrical load without flinching, its heat sinks warming the Montreal or Vancouver listening room as it operated flawlessly hour after hour. It proved to the North American market that in the realm of high-end audio, the quality and stability of the current mattered far more than the marketing metric of total watts. Almost overnight, the DR2 became a cult legend among serious audiophiles. It established Classé not merely as a boutique Canadian curiosity, but as a serious manufacturer of indestructible audio vault doors. The factory footprint in Quebec began to grow, moving from a passion project into a legitimate industrial operation. Reich's circuits gave Classé its scientific soul, but it was Viglas' larger-than-life energy that would push the brand out of the Quebec winter and into the global spotlight. The late 1980s brought a crisis that should have killed the company. David Reich, the brilliant engineering brain behind the DR badge, departed. In the high-end audio world, losing the founding technical visionary usually meant a brand would slowly fade into irrelevance, coasting on old designs until the market moved on. Mike Viglas was left with a factory in Lachine, a growing dealer network, and a terrifying question. Could Classé survive without the man who had invented its sound? Viglas answered by building an industrial fortress. Rather than retreating, Classé doubled down on an obsessive, almost irrational standard of manufacturing. They realized that their survival against massive American competitors, like Krell and Mark Levinson, depended on creating an audio moat. They had to build a level of physical quality control in Quebec that cheaper imports or even larger domestic rivals simply could not afford to fake. To understand this moat, you must understand a transistor, a tiny semiconductor device used to amplify electrical power. In a standard consumer electronics factory, transistors were scooped from a plastic bin and rapidly soldered onto a circuit board, a fiberglass sheet with copper lines that connects electronic components. But transistors are naturally imperfect. Out of a batch of 100, no two perform exactly the same way under stress. If you put slightly mismatched transistors into a high-end amplifier, the electrical timing gets sloppy. The sound becomes smeared, harsh, and tiring to listen to. In the Lachine factory, the process looked completely different. Quebec technicians sat under bright bench lights and microscopes. They measured every single transistor by hand, analyzing their electrical curves and sorting them into perfectly matched pairs. This painstaking labor allowed Classé to build a true symmetrical circuit, an amplifier design where the positive and negative halves of the audio signal are handled by perfectly identical electronic paths, naturally canceling out distortion before it can ever reach the speaker wire. It was a brutally expensive way to build electronics. It required hundreds of hours of highly skilled Canadian labor, but it meant a Classé amplifier left the test bench as a practically flawless instrument. This philosophy birthed the legendary CA series of amplifiers in the 1990s. These were massive silver and black monoliths that redefined the brand's visual identity. When a customer walked into a trusted hi-fi dealer in Calgary or a premium audio showroom in downtown Toronto, a model like the Classé CA400 sat on the floor like a bank vault. They featured incredibly thick, machined aluminum faceplates and rows of oversized internal capacitors, electronic components that store massive reserves of electrical energy, ready to be released instantly for a sudden, explosive kick drum or orchestral swell. A dealer would deliberately wire a CA400 to a pair of notoriously difficult, power-hungry tower speakers. Efficiency, how loudly a speaker plays from a given amount of amplifier power, was the enemy of standard Japanese receivers. A normal amplifier would choke on these speakers, the sound collapsing into a thin, distorted mess. But the Classé simply did not care. It delivered huge, effortless current. In the listening room, the stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from specific physical places between and around two speakers, remained perfectly stable and three-dimensional, no matter how loud the music became. The brand was no longer just David Reich's experiment. It was a formidable Canadian institution. But as the 1990s closed and the new millennium approached, the Canadian and global listening rooms began to shift. The wealthy buyers who could afford a $10,000 amplifier no longer wanted just raw, brutal power. They wanted luxury. They wanted seamless integration. They wanted systems that felt like the future, not just the past. Classé realized that the massive analog amplifier needed a modern brain. They began integrating complex digital control systems into their preamps, the control stage that selects sources, manages volume, and prepares a signal before sending it to the power amp. Instead of a simple, mechanical volume knob that physically turned a resistor, a new Classé preamp featured optical encoders, digital volume chips, and early status screens. To make this happen, the company had to start using the microprocessor, a tiny computer chip that processes digital instructions. The preamp was no longer just a box of wires and switches. It was an active computer monitoring the health, temperature, and routing of the entire audio system. It was a brilliant, highly praised engineering pivot. It allowed a Classé system to look, feel, and operate like a seamless, modern luxury product while retaining its brutal analog power underneath the hood. Audio reviewers loved the convenience. Dealers used the sophisticated interfaces to justify the premium price tags to a new generation of wealthy buyers. The Lachine factory was busier than ever, expanding its workforce and shipping these hybrid analog-digital masterpieces across the United States, Europe, and Asia. The strategy worked flawlessly in the showroom. The system sounded incredible. The company had successfully bridged the gap between old-world power and new-world convenience. By the turn of the millennium, Classé had proven it could survive internal transitions, but its brilliant pivot toward digital control was quietly setting a trap it would not see for years. In 2001, the high-end audio landscape fundamentally shifted, and the boutique Quebec brand found itself at the center of a global acquisition. Bowers Wilkins, the massive British loudspeaker empire known worldwide as B&W, purchased a majority share in Classé Audio. This was not a hostile corporate takeover designed to strip the Canadian company of its assets. It was a strategic marriage born of physical necessity. B&W was building some of the most advanced, demanding loudspeakers on the planet, including their legendary snail-shaped Nautilus series. To demonstrate these highly inefficient acoustic masterpieces in global showrooms, B&W needed electronics that would not fail under extreme pressure. They looked past the massive American and European electronics firms, bypassing established giants, and chose the stubbornly overbuilt amplifiers coming out of Lachine. With the financial backing of B&W's global distribution network, Mike Viglas and the Classé team were handed an unprecedented opportunity. They no longer had to fight for physical shelf space in a crowded Toronto audio showroom, or spend months convincing an independent hi-fi dealer in Vancouver to take a chance on their massive boxes. Classé was about to become the official, factory-endorsed electronic partner for one of the largest premium speaker companies in the world. The stakes were profound. Classé was no longer just a local Canadian success story. It now carried the responsibility of powering the world's most famous acoustic instruments on a global stage. But the British executives and the Canadian engineers both knew that brute force was no longer enough. The global luxury market was changing. A $20,000 audio system could no longer look like a piece of brutalist industrial machinery. It had to look like architectural art. To completely reinvent the brand's visual identity, the group brought in Morton Warren, a renowned industrial designer who had shaped the look of B&W's most iconic modern products. Warren looked at the traditional, sexy, sharp-edged black and silver rectangular boxes that defined high-end Canadian audio and completely discarded them. The result was the Classé Delta series. When the Delta series was unveiled, it shocked the traditional audiophile establishment. The amplifiers were wrapped in massive, continuous sheets of thick aluminum that curved seamlessly from the front faceplate all the way around the sides. The aggressive, exposed heat sinks were hidden inside a sophisticated active cooling tunnel. The sharp corners were gone. To manufacture this new physical chassis in Canada required a staggering financial investment. The curved aluminum faceplate was not stamped out of cheap, thin metal. It was slowly and expensively milled from a solid billet of high-grade aluminum. It required custom tooling and highly specialized CNC machining that drastically increased the manufacturing cost of every single unit that left the Lachine floor. But the most radical change was not the curved metal. It was what sat in the center of the new Delta preamp, the control unit that manages sources and volume before sending the signal to the power amplifier. Instead of a traditional row of mechanical switches and a heavy volume dial, the face of the Delta preamp featured a glowing, full-color LCD touchscreen. Today, a touchscreen is a disposable commodity. But in the early 2000s, placing a computerized touchscreen interface on the front of a pure analog hi-fi instrument was viewed by many traditionalists as a dangerous act of heresy. It required integrating complex software engineering into a Quebec building that was historically dedicated to hand-soldering resistors and matching raw transistors. Yet the gamble worked brilliantly. The touchscreen interface allowed dealers at Bay Bloor Radio in Toronto, or high-end boutiques in New York and London, to offer a wildly sophisticated user experience. A wealthy client building a custom home theater could navigate complex surround sound settings, rename input sources, and monitor the temperature of the amplifiers with a few taps on the glass. The Delta series felt like the absolute bleeding edge of luxury technology. Production at the Lachine facility scaled to meet the exploding global demand. The Canadian factory was no longer just building niche products for local audiophiles. They were exporting pallets of these silver curved monoliths to the most demanding listening rooms on Earth. The true measure of this new era did not happen in a wealthy collector's living room. It happened inside the most critical, unforgiving listening spaces on Earth. When Bowers and Wilkins installed their flagship 800 series loudspeakers as the absolute reference standard in London's legendary Abbey Road studios, those demanding speakers required unshakable, silent power. The studio chose the electronics built in Quebec. Suddenly, a massive array of Classé Delta amplifiers sat quietly in the racks of Abbey Road. Soon after, they were installed across the ocean in California, powering the sprawling scoring stages of Skywalker Sound. To understand the weight of this achievement, you must understand the role of a mastering engineer, an audio professional who makes the final, critical adjustments to a recording before it is released to the public. These engineers do not listen for pleasure. They listen to hunt for microscopic flaws. They need an amplifier to act as a perfectly clear window. If the amplifier adds even a fraction of distortion, unwanted change, or coloration added to the sound, the engineer might mistakenly alter a movie score or a pop album to compensate for it. By trusting the Canadian electronics, these global studios were declaring that a Classé amplifier was practically invisible. It was an astonishing victory for a company that had started with a single 25-watt prototype in Montreal. Back in Lachine, the factory floor was operating at a staggering peak, looking completely unrecognizable from its boutique origins. Production lines were carefully assembling heavy, curved Delta chassis. They were building monoblocks, massive, dedicated amplifiers designed to power only a single audio channel, ensuring absolute electrical isolation and terrifying dynamic power. Because the sleek industrial design of the Delta series eliminated the traditional, sharp exterior heat sinks, the metal fins that pull heat away from internal electronics, Classé engineers had to invent the IC tunnel. This was a sophisticated internal cooling system that drew air through the front of the amplifier, pulled it across an internal radiator, and quietly exhausted it out the back using a microprocessor-controlled fan. It allowed custom home theater installers in Toronto, Vancouver, and New York to stack multiple heavy amplifiers tightly together in equipment closets without them melting down. The strategy was a massive commercial success. Dealers were no longer just selling a single stereo amplifier. They were selling massive multi-channel home theater packages. A wealthy client building a dedicated basement theater did not just want 2 channels of pure power. They wanted 5, 7, or 9 channels perfectly synchronized with high-definition video. Classé was shipping entire pallets of heavy silver boxes, capturing the lucrative peak of the custom installation market. But to maintain that dominance, Classé had to pivot its engineering focus away from simple stereo preamps and pour its resources into the AV processor, a complex home theater control unit that decodes digital surround sound formats, processes high-definition video signals, and manages multiple audio channels simultaneously. Designing a world-class analog power amplifier requires a deep, physical understanding of copper, electricity, and mechanical heat dissipation. A good amplifier design can remain relevant for 20 years. Designing an AV processor requires something entirely different. A massive team of software engineers, expensive licensing agreements for digital decoding formats, and a constant, exhausting cycle of firmware updates. The glowing LCD touchscreen on the front of the Delta series was a brilliant piece of luxury marketing, but it represented a fundamental shift in the company's DNA. Classé was no longer just bending thick metal and matching analog transistors. They were writing thousands of lines of code. They were building highly specialized computers masquerading as traditional high-end audio equipment. For a few glorious years, the balance held perfectly. The massive profits from the home theater boom fueled the Lachine factory, and the brand stood undisputed as a titan of North American luxury audio. The Delta series made Classé a global icon of modern luxury, but the complex processors required to run modern home theaters were about to demand a price that pure analog engineering could not pay. The first crack in the foundation did not happen on the factory floor in Quebec. It happened in the dark, inside a newly finished basement home theater in a wealthy Toronto suburb, right around 2010. A custom installation dealer had just finished wiring a complete Classé Delta surround sound system. In the equipment rack sat the crown jewel of the new era, the Classé SSP-800. It was a massive, beautiful AV processor, the digital brain of the home theater that decodes complex movie soundtracks and routes high-definition video to the projector, all before sending the audio to the power amplifiers. It cost roughly the same as a reliable used car. When the dealer pressed play, the sound was flawless. The pure analog circuitry inside the machine carried the unmistakable, unshakable grip that David Reich had pioneered decades earlier. The customer was thrilled. The dealer left with a massive check. But 2 years later, the customer decided to upgrade their television to a new 3D model, and later to a 4K display. They plugged the new screen into the $10,000 Canadian processor, sat down to watch a movie, and the screen remained entirely black. The massive, beautifully machined piece of luxury audio equipment was completely blind. To understand why a world-class audio brand suddenly found itself facing furious customers over a blank television screen, you must understand the brutal trap of HDMI, a digital cable standard that carries both high-definition video and audio signals simultaneously. For the first 30 years of high-end audio, a connection was made using an RCA cable, a simple, physical copper wire that carries a purely analog signal from a CD player or turntable to an amplifier. An RCA cable built in 1980 will still work perfectly today. It does not require software. It does not ask for permission. HDMI changed everything. It is not just a cable. It is an active two-way digital handshake governed by strict anti-piracy software protocols. And crucially, the consortium that owns the HDMI standard constantly updates it. The industry moved from HDMI 1.3 to 1.4 for 3D video, and then to 2.0 for 4K video. Every time that standard changed, the physical digital video boards inside the Classé SSP-800 became obsolete. This created a terrifying economic paradox for the team in Lachine. Classé was a boutique analog manufacturer. Their core identity was built on winding massive transformers, devices that step down electrical voltage to provide stable power, and matching output transistors under microscopes. A traditional Classé power amplifier could sit in a Canadian living room for 30 years and never need an upgrade. But because they had entered the lucrative home theater market, they were no longer just building amplifiers. They were forced to build highly specialized digital computers. And a computer is only as good as its latest software. When a mass-market Japanese electronics brand built a consumer receiver, they sold hundreds of thousands of units globally. They could easily afford to hire massive teams of software engineers to write new HDMI code, pay the exorbitant licensing fees to the digital consortiums, and simply release a completely new model every 12 months. The consumer treated the receiver as a disposable appliance. Classé could not do that. When a Canadian customer pays over $10,000 for an AV processor, they do not treat it as disposable. They expect it to be a permanent investment. To protect their dealers and their reputation, Classé had to offer hardware upgrade programs. When HDMI 1.4 was introduced, the Lachine factory had to design, manufacture, and ship entirely new digital video circuit boards. Customers had to pack up their heavy processors, ship them to a service center, or have a dealer physically open the chassis, remove the old digital board, and install the new one. Then, the company had to issue complex firmware updates, the permanent software programmed into the machine's memory that tells the hardware how to operate. The financial cost of this cycle was staggering. The immense profits earned from selling those beautiful, curved delta amplifiers were quietly being drained to fund a never-ending firmware war. Classé was employing software engineers to fix video handshake bugs instead of designing better audio circuits. The sheer technical burden of ensuring that a Canadian-made audio processor could correctly talk to a Korean television and an American satellite box began to stretch the boutique company to its absolute limit. Worse still, the nature of digital audio was fundamentally shifting. The physical CD player, a machine that spins a compact disc and reads its data with a laser, was being rapidly replaced by the streamer, a device that pulls digital music files directly from the internet. This meant even pure stereo listening now required constant software updates, network connectivity, and app development. The people assembling the equipment in Quebec were still some of the finest audio craftsmen in the world. The equipment still sounded magnificent. But the rules of the high-end market had fundamentally changed. An audio brand could no longer survive on the quality of its sound alone. It had to survive on the speed of its software. The heavy aluminum faceplates of the Delta series still projected an image of absolute permanence and luxury. But beneath the curved metal, the financial strain of the digital era was pulling the company into dangerous waters. The equipment was still functioning perfectly, but the corporate structure hovering above Lachine was about to undergo a radical, irreversible change. By 2016, the corporate structure protecting the Quebec workshop completely fractured. For 15 years, Bowers Wilkins had provided the global distribution network and financial stability that allowed the Canadian brand to thrive on the world stage. But the British loudspeaker giant was suddenly navigating its own shifting tides. In a move that shocked the traditional high-end audio industry, B&W was acquired by a Silicon Valley startup named Eva Automation. This was not a traditional audio company buying another audio company. This was a technology firm purchasing a legacy brand primarily to acquire its name, its acoustic patents, and its market position. Eva Automation was focused on the future of the living room. They were interested in wireless multi-room audio, cloud integration, smart home ecosystems, and seamless smartphone control apps. They looked at the high-end audio market entirely through the lens of a software developer. When the new executives from California looked at the financial ledger of the Classé division, they did not see a proud Canadian heritage. They did not see the decades of trust built in Montreal listening rooms or Toronto hi-fi dealers. They saw an incredibly inefficient, highly physical manufacturing operation located in an expensive North American city. The brilliant digital processors that had made the Delta series so popular in custom home theaters were now financially toxic. The parent company saw that every time a new HDMI standard forced the Lachine team to engineer a new digital video board, the company absorbed a massive financial hit. They were pouring money into customer support, firmware patches, and hardware replacements just to keep their existing premium processors from going dark. The profit margin, the amount of money a company keeps after paying for materials, labor, and digital licensing, was being crushed by the relentless speed of the tech industry. When a boutique company builds a $10,000 piece of equipment, the wealthy customer expects flawless, uninterrupted operation. If a software bug causes a high-definition projector to drop its signal during a movie, the customer immediately calls the dealer. The dealer aggressively calls the manufacturer. The manufacturer must then halt their advanced engineering team to write a software patch. This cycle is a minor inconvenience for a giant global electronics corporation. For a small team of engineers in Quebec, it was completely unsustainable. Meanwhile, on the analog side of the factory, the craftsmen were still doing exactly what they had done since 1980. They were still measuring output transistors by hand under bright bench lights. They were still bolting massive transformers into thick aluminum chassis. They were building pure brute force amplifiers that would easily last 30 or 40 years. But a Silicon Valley technology firm does not inherently value a physical product that lasts 30 years. They value rapid product cycles, high-volume scalability, and continuous software integration. To the new ownership, a heavy, hand-built Canadian amplifier was a dinosaur. It could not be easily mass-produced by automated machines. It required highly paid, specialized Quebec labor. It was incredibly heavy and expensive to ship across the ocean to European and Asian markets. The conflict was fundamental and unavoidable. Classé was a boutique manufacturer of permanent physical objects, trapped inside a corporate parent that wanted to sell disposable digital convenience. The highly skilled workers in Lachine could build a perfectly symmetrical amplifier circuit that eliminated all measurable audio distortion, but that analog skill could not fix the mathematics on a California spreadsheet. In the autumn of 2017, the final corporate decision was made. EVA Automation initiated a massive restructuring to streamline the B&W portfolio. The wireless speakers and headphones were prioritized. The heavy electronics division in Canada was not. The end did not come slowly. It came as an administrative order. The numbers did not work. The software costs were too high. The spreadsheet dictated the outcome. The analog skills meant nothing. 37 years of Canadian history did not matter. Silicon Valley made the call. The Quebec factory was an unacceptable liability. The closure was immediate. The Lachine facility was shut down. The technicians were dismissed. The soldering irons were unplugged. The microscopes were boxed up. The thick aluminum faceplates stopped arriving. The assembly lines stopped moving. The testing rooms went dark. The spreadsheet won, and the Lachine floor fell totally silent. But the brand's name was far too valuable for the global luxury market to simply let it die. In the months following the silent autumn of 2017, the global audio industry assumed the Canadian amplifier story had finally concluded. But the Classé name possessed too much residual luxury power and too much history in the world's greatest recording studios to simply be erased from the market. In 2018, Sound United, a massive global audio conglomerate that would later be acquired by the medical technology firm Masimo, purchased the brand from EVA Automation. The new corporate parent did not let the badge die. Instead, they funded and authorized the creation of the third generation of the Delta series. These new products were released to glowing international reviews. They retained the iconic, thick, curved aluminum faceplates. They retained the massive high-current power reserves that could effortlessly grip a heavy loudspeaker. But the physical origin of that power had fundamentally shifted. The new Delta series is no longer built in Lachine. Production was relocated thousands of miles away to the legendary Shirakawa Audio Works in Japan. This move saved the brand. Shirakawa is a world-renowned manufacturing facility, famous for producing some of the most immaculate, zero-defect electronics on the planet. The Japanese-built Classé amplifiers are, objectively, marvels of modern industrial engineering. The manufacturing tolerances are tighter than they have ever been. The digital integration is flawless. Yet this absolute perfection highlights the central paradox of the modern high-end audio industry. To survive the brutal economics of global retail and digital obsolescence, the brand had to be rescued by a multinational portfolio. The Canadian badge remains, but the stubborn, highly localized physical soul of the Quebec workshop was traded for the precision of a global supply chain. A Classé amplifier is now a perfect global product, rather than a vulnerable, hand-built Canadian instrument. This philosophical shift explains why, across Canada today, the vintage audio market tells a very different story. If you log onto Canuck Audio Mart, the online classified ecosystem where Canadian audiophiles buy and trade equipment, you will not see collectors furiously hunting for obsolete, 10-year-old AV processors with outdated HDMI boards. Those early digital machines, once the absolute peak of home theater luxury, are often heavily discounted, trapped by the software era they tried to master. Instead, the collectors are hunting for the heavy, brutalist metal boxes of the 1980s and 1990s. They are searching for the original, David Reich-designed DR2, or the massive, unyielding CA400 power amplifiers. These surviving relics matter because they represent a specific, vanished era of Canadian manufacturing, a time before software dictated the lifespan of an audio component. When a vintage audio technician at a repair bench in Toronto or Montreal opens the heavy steel chassis of a 30-year-old Classé amplifier today, they do not find proprietary, disposable, digital video chips. They find massive copper wiring. They find gigantic power transformers. And they find output transistors, the electronic devices that amplify the audio signal, that were individually tested and matched by a human being looking through a microscope in Quebec. Because these early amplifiers were built purely in the physical analog domain, they are not subject to firmware updates. They never require a software patch to continue functioning. If the machine begins to show its age, it undergoes recapping, the process of replacing old, dried-out capacitors with fresh components to restore or stabilize the amplifier's electrical performance. Once repaired, the amplifier returns to the listening room, ready to run flawlessly for another 3 decades. It was built with the stubborn assumption of absolute permanence. The Lachine factory floor is no longer the beating heart of Canadian high-end audio. The global audio machine eventually absorbed the brand, stripped away the punishingly expensive North American manufacturing costs, and repositioned the name as a luxury asset. The Canadian hi-fi era that originally birthed the company, an era where a wealthy listener wanted pure, which were brute force electrical power instead of digital convenience, has been largely replaced by wireless streaming ecosystems, automated room correction, and sound bars. Classé survived the transition, but only by fundamentally changing its nature and leaving its analog origins behind. The brand lives on in the pristine assembly lines of Japan, serving the global market with absolute precision. But the original spirit of the company, the obsessive, inefficient, deeply human desire to build an indestructible vault door for music, never really left Canada. Somewhere in a dim Montreal listening room, a massive silver Classé amplifier with curved aluminum shoulders hums quietly in the dark. Its heavy heat sinks, warming the space as the music begins to spin, carrying the ghost of Lachine into the quiet Canadian night. Every week, we tell the stories of Canadian audio empires that once shaped how people heard music and what happened when the market moved on. See you in the next video.